The theological or divine foundation or basis for law enforcement, very briefly and very basically, traces itself back to Adam and Eve. We are taught that when God created Adam and Eve, he gave them 6 commandments. After the flood, when Noah came out of the ark, God repeated these 6 commandments and added a 7th. And since then, these 7 commandments, addressed to all of the descendants of Noah, which is all of mankind, are called the Noahide laws, the Noahide commandments. At the revelation at Sinai, God repeated these 7 commandments that are universal, that apply to all human beings, and gave us the obligation to spread those teachings, to make this known to all nations of the world. But before we get to the actual commandments, the details, a little bit of a background of some of the thoughts, some of the thinking of our relationship with God, our relationship to ourselves, and our relationship to our times. Let's start with the times. 3 words: confusion, drifting, and alienation. I think if we go back to the 50s, the issues, the questions, the discomfort that people wrestled with was a question of truth. Who is telling me the truth? And how do we know what is the truth? It was a philosophical time. And I remember getting into all sorts of philosophical debates. You could not have a conversation without debating ultimate truths. It was the popular thing. People wanted to know. My grandfather tells me one thing from the old country. He tells me that these are the truths, these are the way we're supposed to live, these are the principles by which we live. At school, I hear other things. In the media, we read opposite things. Who's telling me the truth, and how will I know? Prove it to me was the big question. Can you prove to me that there's a God? Prove to me that God gave the commandments. Prove to me that God revealed himself at Sinai, and so on. This went on for a while, and what was happening is that the questioner was not receiving any satisfying answers. Everybody insisted on their own truth. There was no way of proving one truth over another. The truths were not compatible. And so there was a frustration, a confusion. Confusion comes basically not from a lack of information, that's ignorance. Confusion comes from conflicting information. When you know a lot and it's not coming together, it's not leading to one single conclusion. So there's confusion. I hear a lot of things and I don't know how to process it. I think that was the 50s. When the 60s came around, the frustration of not getting a satisfying answer finally led to all sorts of disruption, to rebellion of sorts. Although there was a wise man who came to the United States in the 60s, and he was told that there was a revolution going on. Now, he was from Russia, and he knew what revolution meant. And they told him there's a revolution in America, and he said, no, there isn't. He says, there can't be. You don't have the conditions for a revolution. So somebody tried to explain to him how there was this youth rebellion, and there was the nonconformist and the anti-establishment, and so on and so forth. So this man says, yeah, but that reminds me of a frog. He says, you know when a frog looks at his kid, he's shocked. Kid doesn't look like him at all. They don't look alike, they don't swim the same way, they don't do the same things. There's a generation gap. And the frog doesn't know what's going to become of his children. But wait, it'll be a frog just like his father. And this was in the 60s, and when we see all these rebels of the 60s who are now in pinstripe suits and they're into business and they're making a lot of money, just like their father, it took a while. So a real revolution it wasn't, but obviously signs of unrest, dissatisfaction. And what it produced was the second stage, drifting. Drifting means you basically come to the conclusion that nobody is telling you any truth. Everybody has an opinion, nobody is telling you any truth. So you can dabble, a smorgasbord of ideas in life, and you don't have to take any one idea too seriously because there is no absolute final truth. It's a matter of experience. So you try this a little bit, you try that a little bit, and you drift from thing to thing. And you hitchhike across Europe, and you try and experiment with different things just to see, drifting. Well, that can go on for a while. It can be fun. It can be educational. It can also be very frustrating. So after about 10, 15 years of that, the drifting quickly turned into alienation. Alienation, an example, this student was hitchhiking through Europe for a number of years. He had been into meditation, he had been into politics, he had been into various things. And one day, wherever he was, someplace in Europe, he felt like it was time to go home. And so he goes to the airport. And as he approaches the counter, it suddenly strikes him. He has no place to go. He has severed his ties with his family. His family, the family itself had come apart. His mother lives in one place, his father in another place. He hasn't spoken to either of them in years. He doesn't belong anywhere. He has no home to go home to. So after 12 years of drifting, he had successfully cut himself loose. And now when the drifting has kind of lost its appeal and he wants to go back, there's no place to go back to. He is alienated. He doesn't have a family to go back to, a home to go back to, a commitment to go back to, an identity to go back to, nothing. And that's the alienation. And that frustration, that troubled stage is where we really start getting into serious problems. I heard from an elder relative of mine, when the Allies came in and liberated the camps in Poland, the concentration camps, and with great fervor and with great joy, they came in and told the inmates that they're free to go, that piece of news was devastating to them. It wasn't a relief, because the cities they came from in Poland no longer existed. Their families were scattered, they didn't know whether they were alive or not, and to be thrown out of the concentration camp was frightening. Because at the very least, in the concentration camp, they had this one shelf in the barracks, which was their bed. They had slept in it for a month now. And that became their focal point. This is my bed. That's all they had left in life. So this total alienation, where you suddenly cling ferociously and totally irrationally to something that offers no identity, that is not a home, that is not a lifestyle, that is not a place to hang your hat, and yet, for lack of anything else, you cling to it, you make a philosophy out of it, you develop a relationship with it which is unhealthy, non-productive, counterproductive, but what are you going to do? It's terrible, it's worse to be nowhere. So alienation produces the most devastating symptoms of the three. If we were to apply it to religion and to belief in God, you might say that confusion is something that can be resolved through education, by proper learning. Drifting can be resolved by discipline. How do we resolve alienation? Here's where the clergyman has to come in. Let's take a look at ourselves for a moment. Again, three parts. The human being, with all of our activities and all of our attributes, can basically be summed up in three words: being, pleasure, and temper. That's basically what we are. It's a little humbling, but it's true for the most part. The first thing is that we are. We be. There's a being here. We exist. And the existence is a conscious one. We sense our own existence. We defend our existence. We have an immediate and powerful reaction to anything that threatens our existence. We're basically bent on surviving. We have a survival instinct, and we will do anything to just be, to retain the status of being. Now, when we take this state of being seriously, that's our state of pleasure. I enjoy my life. I want my life. I like myself the way I am. That is my state of pleasure. If I take my pleasure seriously, then I develop a temper. Because if you interfere with my pleasure, I don't like it. I don't like you. Or I like you because you have something I want that will give me pleasure. So my temper, my mood, is basically a response to my pleasures. My pleasures is a response to my being. So if I sense that I am, I take my pleasures seriously, then I don't like you because you interfere with my pleasures. That's basically what the human being is all about. I am uncomfortable with a stranger, even though he's never done anything bad to me. He doesn't threaten me in any obvious way. But the very fact that he exists independent of me means that I am not all I thought I was, because I thought I was the center of the universe. And here, you exist independent of me, and you don't even know that I exist. So what are you doing here? Not what are you doing to me, what are you doing here? Why do you exist if you're not in some way an auxiliary or satellite of my existence? So unless you're here to support me because you think I'm great, then you shouldn't exist. And that's a human instinct, by the way, not a perversion. This is a perfectly natural human instinct. I exist and I protect my existence. Therefore, as soon as I meet you, my first question is, why? Why are you? And from that come all the little irritations about, well, I don't like him because of this, and I don't like him because of that, and who is he anyway, and he's not so smart, and he's not so this and that and the other. But at the heart of it all is, he doesn't have to be at all, unless he somehow supports my existence, contributes to my importance. So this is basically the human being. I am, that's very serious, get out of my way. That's life. So we spend 80 years doing that. I am, that's very important. Now get out of my way. You got into my way. Well, I'm going to have to fight with you now to get you out of my way. And that's how we spend our life. Now here again, if I have a temper and every little thing bothers me and I can't get along with anybody, even with my own children, with my wife, with my boss, then it's time to see a psychologist. The psychologist will tell me that if I speak more softly, if I avoid certain abrasive terms, I won't get into as many fights. And life might be a lot easier. This psychologist was advising a group of people on how to speak in a certain manner and using certain terms that will diffuse an argument between a husband and wife. And gave examples of how you come home after a day's work and you use certain terms that are just bound to start an argument. And if you use different terms, it would avoid the argument. And it was all very good until a woman got up and said, but what if your husband comes home and he wants to have an argument? Then advising him on which words to use isn't going to help. He's picking a fight. He's looking for a fight. So the psychologist will tell you how to avoid the fight, what words to use, what words not to use, assuming that you want to avoid the fight. If you don't want to avoid the fight, if you have some very deep need to get into fights, well, that's your pleasure level. The first level was your temper. The second is your pleasure. Somehow, you've got pleasure, you're getting pleasure from the wrong things. Now you got to go to a psychiatrist. because he's got to figure out what is deeply wrong with you that is distorting not your temper, but your pleasure. What do you want? What do you really want? It's not how you act, it's where are you coming from? What are you driving at? What are you trying to get with this behavior? So the psychologist can deal with the temper. The psychiatrist can deal with your pleasure. But who deals with your essential being? Only God. Again, here's where the clergyman comes in. If you're coming from a position of faith, you can say to a person, it is not acceptable. God does not approve of people losing their temper. So don't lose your temper. Speak nicely. You can also come to a person and say, God does not approve of your looking for pleasure in places that are not worthy of pleasure, like enjoying a good fight. So you can apply moral principles to these issues, in addition to the psychology and psychiatry. But only God is relevant when it comes to the subject of being. We take our existence very seriously. And the only antidote to that is to take God seriously. The very notion that God created us softens this absolute blind faith in our own existence. If we were created, then our existence is only a secondary one. To forget that we were created means that our being becomes infinite, becomes eternal in our own mind, and we become gods. We start believing in ourselves. And then everything else follows from there. If my existence is essential, then my pleasure becomes important. Then you're getting in my way becomes a sin. Then you're bad, not me. If you don't let me have what I want, you're wrong. I'm right. Because my existence demands this, and my existence is absolute. Once I find out that God created me, and that after 120 years I have to go back and give a report for my very existence, then I can't take my existence so seriously. I can't become religious about myself. So here again, the influence of belief, the influence of God becomes essential. And I think that in our stage, at our time today, along with the alienation, which is a desperation for being, we have this romance or this extreme devotion to being. I am. I think all the rock songs and all the I am me, there's an obsession with self. And the slightest denial is perceived as a total threat to one's existence. So when we come to a teenager today and we say you can't take drugs, we're not saying anything at all. When we come to the teenager today and we say just say no, we're not saying anything at all. Because any denial, the statement that you cannot, doesn't matter what it is, as soon as I say you can't, I am threatening their very existence. Because the only thing that's left in this confusion and drifting and alienation is that I am. Now if you tell me that my existence can be curtailed, then you're telling me that that last thing that I thought I had, I don't even have that. Well, then what do I have? I was speaking about this amorality to a high school group. I think it was in Plymouth. And I was talking about the fact that a society, a family, a people that doesn't teach right from wrong, that doesn't say this is acceptable and this is not, this is allowed and this is not, frustrates its own members by denying them freedom of choice. If nothing is right and nothing is wrong, then what choice do I have? The freedom of choice that God gives us is the freedom to choose between good and evil. But if nothing is good and nothing is evil, then what have you done to my freedom of choice? I was saying this, and out of the whole auditorium full of students, there were 2 kids there with only a small amount of hair left on their head, and what was left was green. And it was standing straight up, and they were wearing clothes to match. And as I was saying this about the frustration of not knowing right from wrong, and they were giving me these most vigorous, positive agreement nods, and they were getting very excited. And I can just imagine, they didn't stay long enough for me to talk to them afterwards, but I can just imagine what they were feeling. Here were kids who felt like being bad. They felt like being bad. By the way, psychology says that nobody ever wants to be bad. They're either looking for approval, they're looking for an expression, they're looking for pleasure, they're looking for an escape. They never want to be bad. The Bible says that there's an instinct in us that wants to be bad. And if you don't find something to be bad with, we'll make it up. But there's got to be something bad as an outlet for this instinct when at times we feel like being bad. So they felt like doing something bad. So they shaved their head. They were kind of nervous. They'd never done this before. And they made their hair stand up, and they turned it green, and then chose clothing to fit, and then came downstairs to breakfast for the first time in this. And what did today's modern, liberated, understanding, patient, tolerant parents do? They ignored it. They weren't going to make a scene about it. They were going to prove that they're cool, which is not what the teenager wanted. He wanted to outrage them. He wanted to do something to get a reaction from them. And he comes downstairs, and the mother says, "How do you want your eggs?" Green. So I can imagine. Green. Punk eggs. So I can imagine this kid is thinking, my God, what do I have to do to get a reaction from these people? And the truth is, what do we have to do? Remember Gary Gilmore? Gary Gilmore was on death row, and he wanted to be killed. He wanted to be executed. And everybody was saying, oh, no, you're a good guy. He says, no, I'm not a good guy. I'm the murderer, remember? And they said, yeah, you were suffering from a traumatic dislocation of your maturing processes. We'll fix that in no time. And he says, no, don't give me that. I am a murderer. And he actually said, let me out. Give me 24 hours. I'll kill somebody, all right? What does a man have to do to prove that he's a murderer besides murder? Then you got to plead your case in court to convince people that you are a murderer. So the guy was basically saying, look, I've got very little dignity left in my life. Give me the one credit. Call me a murderer and punish me. And they say, oh, no, you had a difficult childhood. So without an absolute right and wrong, we frustrate ourselves by denying ourselves the very basic freedom of choice. It works in reverse too. If a kid gets up in the morning and feels like being good today, what will he do? That people will say, ah, that's good. Nothing. Unless he's Superman and can save the planet from destruction from alien forces. I mean, what else would be recognized as a moral good? If he helps an old lady across the street, well, that's not good, that's wimpish. So unless he's Rambo, he's nothing. And so we've basically frustrated ourselves morally by this lack of clear definition. I know that when we were in school and we wanted to be bad, it wasn't difficult at all. Because, well, for example, Saturday morning we had to go to services at 9 o'clock, and we weren't supposed to eat before prayer. So when we were in a very evil mood, we snuck a piece of cake. And that was very satisfying because we had sinned. You know, you don't have to climb a tower and shoot 19 people before somebody will call you bad. And before you can satisfy this little urge to do something naughty. Let's get around to the commandments. When God came to Mount Sinai and he says, I am God, your God, who took you out of Egypt. These are my commandments. God was basically saying, I want to make myself known. And with God also, there are three parts. There's what God wants, there are divine attributes, and there is creation, God the Creator. God created a world in which holiness is not obvious. You look at the world and you don't recognize immediately that there was a creator. Creation conceals its creator. Unless you study and you think and you ponder and you look past the surface and discover that this world must have had a creator, and so on and so on and so on. But by looking at it, the world claims its own existence. It does not proclaim God's existence. And that's how God wanted it. A world in which he is not obvious. Then there are divine attributes. Kindness, forgiveness, compassion, patience. Divine attributes. Justice. And we are meant to mimic those attributes. Just as God is kind, we should be kind. Just as God is merciful, we should be merciful, and so on. And that's where we are moved internally to love God, to believe in God, to serve God, and so on. And then there is God's will. What does he want? Why did he do all of this? Now, God comes down to Mount Sinai and says, I am God, your God. I want to tell you what I want, what I'm all about. And people wondered, why doesn't God speak to angels? Why doesn't he tell them what he wants? Aren't they more likely to understand? We're human beings. We have our problems. We have our unholy and godless instincts and feelings and so on. The angels are pure and innocent and holy. Shouldn't God speak to them? Well, there's one problem with angels. They are very holy. And in their holiness and in their appreciation for God, it becomes impossible to speak to them. You can imagine as God approaches, the angels get excited. When they hear the voice of God from afar, they start fluttering, right? They start getting ecstatic. And they start dancing and proclaiming, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And once in a while, God would like to talk to them just one-on-one. Like, you know, let his hair down and say, let me tell you what this is all about, why I created, and they're already dancing, holy, holy, holy. And God says, excuse me, can you calm down for a second? I want to tell you why I created the world. And they said, this is incredible, God is speaking, and they get all excited. And God can't get a word in edgewise. So with the angels, God has a big problem. The divine attributes are so strong, the angels' love of God and appreciation of holiness and awesomeness and infinity and omnipotence and all the rest of that is so intense that as soon as the subject of God is raised, they're already so ecstatic they can't hear you. They are experiencing their own religious feelings. And ironically, that precludes God. God can't speak when you are experiencing your religious ecstasy. I don't know if it's a good example, but when in marriage counseling, a husband and wife come to the marriage counselor, and the husband says, I don't know why she's not happy. I don't know why she's not happy. I'm a good husband. I love her. She's everything in my life. She's my whole world. I don't know why she's not happy. She says, he never listens to me. I can't talk to the man. He ignores me. He doesn't care about me. He says, what are you talking about? I love you dearly. You're the most precious thing in my life. And this goes on for 10 years. Finally, they come to the marriage counselor. He says, I can't figure out what she wants. So the marriage counselor says, well, let's ask her. She's right here. So we turn to the wife and we say, wife, tell the husband what you want. And she says, I've told him 1,000,000 times. He says, what? What did you tell me? She said, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I don't like when you criticize my sister. He says, that? That's what you want? Come on, get serious. What do you really want? And that's the problem. He doesn't hear her. He is devoted to being a good husband. And he read the manual, the book on how to be a perfect husband, and he's doing it. He's doing everything the book says to do in order to be a good husband, because he loves her. He does. He loves her. Without her, he has no reason to live. And so he's devoted to her, and he thinks about her all the time, and he buys her presents. He's obsessed with her. But that's his feeling for her. When she opens her mouth, he says, "Don't interrupt me. I'm busy loving you." And he means it. He means it. She starts complaining about something, and he says, "You're so beautiful when you're angry." And she says, "I can't talk to the man. He doesn't listen to me." And he says, "But I love you." And there's the trap. He loves her, and he is so devoted to being a perfect husband. He is so determined to be a model husband that she is forgotten in the process. It's like, I'm going to be a good husband whether she likes it or not. We do this with God. When we're experiencing our own religious ecstasy, our feeling for godliness and holiness and matters of the Spirit, can God still talk to us, or are we too busy? So there's the will of God. What does he want? And if he turns around and says, "I don't want you to steal a nickel from the guy next to you," and we turn around and we say, "Come on, God, please grow up. You're supposed to be infinite. You're my God. What am I going to tell people? That my God gets upset over a nickel? Don't you have bigger issues, more divine kinds of things to worry about?" That's what we do with our wives, with our husbands. "You get upset when I do such and such. Come on, get upset about bigger things." So we tell them what to want. We tell God what to want. We say, look, you're my God, and I'm going around talking about you all over town. Don't embarrass me. Be everything I claim you are. Don't come down and tell me that you get upset over a nickel just because it happens to be his nickel, not my nickel. That's petty. All right, if it was $1 million. So we have focused very strongly on God's creation. I mean, technology, space travel, we've mastered it. We've mastered it. We're very fluent and familiar, at least most of us in this world, with divine attributes. We know that kindness is better than severity. We know that charity is better than to be stingy. We know all these wonderful things, and we have a feeling for it, and we try at times to live up to these divine attributes and to imitate God and so on. But what happened to God's will? What does he want? We dismiss that. Oh, he doesn't want anything. He's happy. He's happy. Look, all these people love him. He's got to be happy. If he was happy, he wouldn't have created a world that is such a mess, that needs so much fixing, which is why we're all here. He created the world because he, for his divine reasons, wants to dwell on earth. He wants to have a dwelling place in the lowest possible creation. So he creates the lowest possible condition, which is us, and then wants to become perfectly comfortable here so that his dwelling place is on earth and not in heaven. How will he become comfortable here? We got to clean house for him. We've got to clean the house. We've got to prepare it so that it becomes a comfortable, welcoming place for God, so that God can feel comfortable on earth. How do we do that? He gives us instructions. He gives us instructions. He says, these are the ways in which you can make the world comfortable for me, which is why I created the world in the first place. Now, I know there are theological problems. Why does God want to live on earth? Why is he not content where he is? And if he needs something and wants something, is he still as divine as we thought he was? Because if he is really so divine, why does he need anything at all? I know, we've studied these subjects in yeshiva I've studied them for 14 years. Does God really need? Is it a voluntary need? That's an oxymoron, a voluntary need. Okay, these are theological subjects that are a pleasure to study and debate. But if we turn around and we say to God, who tells us that he wants a dwelling place in the lower world, if we turn around and we say to him, oh, come on, what do you really want? What do you really want? You must want faith, right? He says, yeah, well, what am I going to do with your faith? We say, well, then I guess you want love. What is he going to do with our love? So we're telling him what we think he ought to want, the things we respect, higher things. But to God, nothing is higher. He is high. There's nothing higher. So for God to love is not an improvement on God. That makes sense, I think. God wants something out of the lower world. How does he want it? Why does he want it? How come he wants it? That's not really my business. It's fun to think about. But I can't reject his statement like I do with my wife. And, oh, come on, you don't really want that. What do you really want? Come on, get down to business. And if that's what you really want, then I guess I made a mistake. I shouldn't have married you. We can't do that with God. If God says that he wants a dwelling place in the lower world and that it's accomplished by following these instructions, then we take his word for it. The 6 commandments God gave to Noah, to Adam and Eve. Not to worship idols, not to be blasphemous, not to murder, not to steal, not to commit sexual sin, and to have courts of law. And a court of law means judges and policemen who teach the other 5 commandments and enforce the obedience of those commandments. Until the flood, which was 1,000 years from Adam and Eve, from creation till the flood, God had never given permission to eat meat, to eat flesh. So everybody was vegetarian for 1,000 years. After the flood, when Noah came out of the ark, and he had been commanded to take 2 of each animal that was not kosher, but 7 of every animal that was kosher. That's because he was going to eat after the flood. So when he came out of the ark, God said to him, you may eat of all the flesh, but don't drink the blood. Now that he had been given permission to eat meat, he was given a 7th commandment, not to be cruel to animals. You can use an animal for food and for nourishment and so on, but you cannot be cruel to the animal. You may not eat a limb that was taken from a living animal. So now we have 7 commandments, the 7 Noahide laws. Not to believe in idols, not to be blasphemous, not to murder, not to steal, not to commit sexual sin, not to be cruel to animals, and to have courts of law. We read the story of the sons of Jacob when Dinah was raped, kidnapped, and her 2 brothers went into the city of Shechem and wiped out every adult male. And Jacob was angry with them. They lost their temper. They took the law in their own hands, and he criticizes them for it. But for wiping out an entire city, you would think that they would get more than a slap on the wrist, more than just criticism. You'd think they'd be ostracized, excommunicated. They weren't. The basis for their decision was that courts of law means that every adult male in a given society is responsible to object to immorality when they see it and to enforce morality when necessary. The fact that their leader had kidnapped and raped a woman and no adult male said anything meant that this was a society without courts of law. So they were violating the 7th commandment of the Noahide laws, and that's punishable by death, biblically. The problem was that these 2 brothers took the law in their own hands, but what they did was the law. Nobody empowered them to be the enforcers. So Jacob was angry at them for taking the law in their own hands, but they were not guilty of wanton murder because there was a death penalty connected to the sin of not having courts of law. According to biblical law, according to God, we are not allowed to live in a society that doesn't have a court. We're not allowed to abide by a court that is immoral. We have an obligation to enforce and teach the other 6 commandments, and to believe that any human being who abides by those 7 commandments is a perfect human being in God's eye and has a portion in the world to come. Anybody who violates one of those commandments can identify his sin and correct it. Which one of the 7 did you fail? Fix it. There's no guesswork. In today's society, having heard what you heard yesterday about the growth of satanic cults and all sorts of things, where life itself has become meaningless to the average teenager, where you cannot come to a teenager and say, if you smoke that or sniff that or inject that, you will die, and hope that that will discourage them because they are willing to die, because they almost want to die, because teenagers are committing suicide for no apparent reason at all, and there shouldn't be any reason for a teenager to ever commit suicide. Life itself has become dispensable. There's only one response, and that response has to be not something in creation. Creation can be confusing. You can't talk about it's unhealthy, it's not safe. That doesn't work. We're not getting anywhere with that. You can't talk about divine attributes. You can't say it isn't nice, be kind, be nice to yourself, respect yourself. These things are not working either. There's only one thing left. We have to talk about God's will. What does God want? Why did He create you? Every morning when you get up, God hopes that today you will do what He created you to do. What is that? 7 commandments. You want to become more spiritual, you want to get into the attributes of God, that's fine. But that's your part. What God wants, what God needs, is 7 commandments. Follow those 7 commandments, and you are fulfilling the purpose for which God created you. You are turning this world into a home for God. That's what He wants. This is concrete. This is getting to the heart of the issue. This is the antidote to I am and who are you. This gets to the heart of total alienation. I don't belong anywhere, so I might as well die. Not true. You are God's creation, and you are in the employ of God. He needs you, that's why He created you. And He needs you not to make you happy, He needs you because He has a need. And you have the privilege and the opportunity to fulfill that need for God. It's a whole different world now. It's a whole different picture. Your mood becomes less important, so that even if you're in a bad mood or not such a good mood, you do what you have to do. Even if you're not inspired and ecstatic with love and fervor for God, you do what He wants, because His will is more important than your will. It becomes a world in which we can live, and in which we can all be doing the same thing. Jews were given 613 commandments. We are the priests of the world, or the holy nation. But what do we do? Whatever it is God needs. Mankind was given 7 commandments. Why do we do them? Because that's what God needs. And at this point in history, this is what we need. We need to hear, what was it God said at Sinai? Don't tell me how much you love God. Tell me how much God needs me. Not how much He loves me. How much He needs me. Because if He loves me, it puts the burden on me. If He needs me, the burden is on Him. And I'm only here to serve Him. So He is really God, not me. And that's a relief. It's difficult being God. So in law enforcement, we're not talking about the good guys against bad guys. We're not talking about the people who believe in laws and the people who don't believe in laws. I was driving a student to the bus station one night, and we were talking about the 613 commandments that govern every aspect of a Jew's life, and how every one of them is of equal importance, and there are no lesser and greater laws, and there are 613 primary laws, and then there are about 1,000 customs and traditions to go with it. And just then, a policeman pulls me over. I was driving, and I hadn't come to a full stop. And I roll down the window, and he says, "Don't you believe in obeying laws?" I said, you won't believe it. We have many laws, and it's those laws that give our life meaning. It's not good guys against bad guys. Laws were never given for bad guys. Criminals don't have any laws. Laws are given for good people who want to do the right thing, but need to be told what the right thing is and need to be encouraged or reminded to stay on the right track. So that law enforcement doesn't mean the good guys beating up on bad guys or bad guys outsmarting the good guys. So that when we try to enforce laws, it's not that we're trying to control the behavior of others. We don't take responsibility for good and evil in the world. God created good and evil. What we're doing is obeying a commandment. I'm obeying a commandment to enforce the law. Will you please obey the commandment to not break the law? And we're talking about divine commandments. Stopping at a stop sign, going through a red light. These are auxiliary commandments that are there to protect us so that we are enabled to observe the divine commandments. If we can't get this message through to the young people, if we can't get this through to the legislators, to the people who make the laws, who enforce the laws, then we don't have a healthy society. No matter what kind of medicine or treatment or analysis we're going to go through, we're not going to have a healthy society unless we're healthy at our essence, in our core. And that is, I am here to serve God. Tell me what He wants and I will do it. Thank you for listening after all these hours. Thank you for having these kinds of sessions that help keep the faith alive, that people are good and people are doing what God wants and God's plan will be actualized, and that with a little more effort, we can make this world a divine place so that Mashiach can come and put the final touches on all of these things that need to be fixed.
We have a Sunday night program for VIPs that you might be interested in. It's informal, it's questions and answers, it's conversation. It's really relaxed, it's really pleasant, enjoyable, informative, and kind of community-like. It's a Sunday night program, there's a Wednesday morning program for the VIPs, and there's a Wednesday night program. All of it just conversation, casual, laid-back, unscripted. So join us, take a look, click the link below, and see which of the three suits you best, and join us for some enjoyable conversation.